From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Speaker McCarthy says we should see a vote on the debt ceiling on the House floor by next week, while Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer expresses optimism at the progress being made.
I am pleased that over the course of this week, everyone has acknowledged that allowing the country to default would be a catastrophe. I'm also pleased that the other side has recognized the best way forward is a bipartisan piece of legislation that can secure enough votes to get through both the House and the Senate.
A key ally of Speaker McCarthy pouring cold water on all that, though, saying no deal is near. Our exclusive interview with Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema is coming up. The independent legislator laying blame at the feet of both Democrats and Republicans.
The bottom line is that both political parties are guilty of playing fire when it comes to the debt limit. We should never play with fire when it comes to the full faith and credit of the United States of America.
And while the drama unfolds here at home, President Biden is overseas at the G7 summit in Japan. Our Anne-Marie Hordern is live from there, has an interview with the National Security Council spokesman, Admiral John Kirby.
Kaylee, we're going to start right there in Hiroshima, Japan, and join Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern right now. How's it going, Anne-Marie?
Good evening, guys. It's so great to be with you. As you just outlined there, the top stories in Washington, D.C. are clearly the cloud that's hanging over the president here in Hiroshima. It is about the debt ceiling. The president is here to try to shore up allies, especially when it comes to how they want to approach China, especially on the economic front. They have this initiative about economic coercion. And at the same time, what global leaders are concerned about is a default out of the United States. And I asked Admiral Kirby, is there a concern that the dysfunction in Washington and the concerns around domestic policy are starting to undermine this administration's foreign policy goals? Because, of course, the president is cutting his trip short. He will no longer be going to Papua New Guinea, and he will no longer be going to Australia. Take a listen to what Admiral Kirby had to say.
So the president is doing the right thing here. He's obviously, the G7 is important. A lot of things to discuss while we're here in Japan. We can reschedule a trip to Australia. We can reschedule a trip to Papua New Guinea. You know what you can't reschedule? You can't reschedule the looming debt ceiling deadline. That is a hard fixed thing, and we've got to make sure we get these negotiations through.
Critics will say then the president didn't manage this correctly. He should have been speaking to Speaker McCarthy earlier so he didn't have to cancel his foreign trip. But do you think the president here in the G7 will be able to say to leaders the U.S. will not default on its debt?
Well, the president's optimistic. He said that before we left. He said that he's optimistic that we'll get there. And so that's one of the reasons why we're going home a little bit early, so that he can be there to make sure that Congress does its job. But let's go back a little second on the talking to Speaker McCarthy. Defaulting is a congressional duty. Mm-hmm. It's in the Constitution. There didn't need to be negotiations over the debt. Now, the president is willing to sit down and talk to Speaker McCarthy about the budget and appropriations, and we'll do that.
The White House is obviously adamantly defending this decision by the president, but it is a concern amongst allies in Europe, also Asia Pacific, that the president is cutting this trip to Papua New Guinea. He's supposed to be the first U.S. president to go there. We do know that Xi Jinping met the prime minister of Papua New Guinea in November. And, of course, to Australia, where he would have been meeting the Quad. In Australia, he is going to be having that meeting here in Hiroshima. What you're hearing from some officials behind the scenes is that this is just dysfunction now they expect from Washington when it comes to the debt ceiling.
All right, Anne-Marie, thank you so much. Have a good day there in Japan. And tomorrow, Anne-Marie will be sitting down with the U.S. ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, to discuss the G7 meeting, countering China, and what comes next for the U.S.-Pacific relationship. But meanwhile, as Anne-Marie was just talking about, the debt ceiling negotiations are continuing here in Washington. And earlier today, we had the opportunity to speak with a woman who sits at the intersection of both parties, Independent Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. We started by asking her about where she stands on this issue.
Can you tell our listeners and viewers, where are your red lines on this?
Well, first, one thing to remember is I'm proud to be the independent Senate from Arizona, and so I'm happy to join you all today. I actually don't tend to talk in terms of red lines, and in fact, I think that when folks come around and start talking about red lines, that's how you tend to not get to a deal. So what we've got to do is really focus on coming together to find areas of shared agreement. The default, the possibility of default, is a threat to every single one of us in this nation, regardless of whether they're a Democrat, Republican, or an independent. So our goal here has to be about solving the challenge and doing it together. Now, if you ask me about what should I think we do about the debt limit and default, the bottom line is that both political parties are guilty of playing fire when it comes to the debt limit. When either party is in the minority, they demand requirements from the other party in order to get to a deal. And unfortunately, that's been happening for years, and it's a mistake. It's wrong. We should never play with fire when it comes to the full faith and credit of the United States of America. Now, here we are
Senator,
today.
We know that you have had a long history of relationships with some of the key players in these negotiations, a long working relationship with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, with Steve Ricchetti, who is negotiating on the side of the White House, as well as the OMB Director, Shalonda Young. So what are you telling them directly? How have you been involved in these conversations?
Well, the good news is that we've now got the right people in the room to have the conversation and come to an agreement. And I am beginning to feel more and more confident each day that such an agreement will occur. We've got some really good news here. One is that Kevin McCarthy has said over and over he doesn't want to have a default. His folks are in the room negotiating to prevent a default and solve this challenge. Steve Ricchetti and I have negotiated many a deal together in the past several years, and he's a good voice for the president. And Shalonda Young, she's the smartest person in the building. She knows the budget and appropriations inside out. So with those folks at the table, I feel confident that they're going to come to an agreement and that we'll be able to stave off default and get back to the business of governing our country.
Your confidence is refreshing, Senator, though there are a lot of questions right now about work requirements. This seems to be where a lot of the action is in the negotiating room here, and I wonder where your line is. President Biden says he's open to additional work requirements for programs like SNAP, but draws the line at Medicaid. Do you agree with him?
It's funny because you keep mentioning the word line. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, when folks put up red lines, it makes it harder to solve the problem, not easier. The reality is in our country, we've long had modest work requirements for some entitlement programs. And continuing those makes relevant sense. The conversation about whether or not we'll have fewer or more of those in the future is really a discussion that belongs in the negotiating room, not on television cameras.
If ultimately that is included in the package, Senator, would you still vote yes to that deal?
I like how you guys keep trying to come back to the red line question, and I'll just tell you right here and now, I'm not going to answer it. But I am happy to talk about how I think we can move forward after this conversation to prevent a future situation like this one. In fact, I just introduced a bill with Senator Ernst that would ensure that Congress gets accurate, nonpartisan information every year about the true facts around the fiscal state of our nation. That way, as members of Congress and senators, we're all informed about what our financial situation is like. And then rather than playing politics and playing fire with the full faith and credit of the United States of America, perhaps we might choose to get serious about fiscal discipline and taking care of the fiscal health of our nation.
Senator, you had a long list of questions today for the Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, Michael Barr, in a Senate Banking Committee hearing, looking into the causes and the fallout from the bank collapses that we've witnessed over the past couple of months here. Among your questions, it really got to authority, oversight, supervision here. And I wonder if at this point, following your conversation with Michael Barr today, you're satisfied with the Fed exercising its full authority, or does Congress need to mandate something here?
Well, it's been clear from the last two times that Vice Chair Barr has testified in the Banking Committee that he's acknowledged two things. One, that the agency did have sufficient authority to provide oversight and failed to do so appropriately. Today, he talked about making internal changes around the culture of his organization. And as you heard in my questions, I've encouraged him to create a detailed plan and report it quarterly to Congress so that he's accountable to us for actually implementing that plan. But one thing that we know is clear. The agency, the Fed, had the authority and chose not to exercise it over SVB and other banks that have faced failures. And that is a failure on their part. So as you saw today, I've encouraged them and tell them that we expect them to actually do their job and do it at the speed of business. One thing we've learned is that the Fed was too slow in responding to elements or signs of risk. They would ask questions of the bank, but didn't hold them accountable and didn't do so in real time. That's something they need to do, is modernize so they can actually respond to these threats in real time, just like we as consumers respond to the threats or challenges we face in real time.
So, Senator, that's something you'd like to see the regulators do internally, but is there anything you'd like to see Congress do legislatively? Are there any measures, bills that you would support to address the banking crisis?
There are a number of pieces of legislation that we've introduced in a bipartisan way, including legislation that would claw back the executive bonuses and other inappropriately taken income on the part of these executives. But in terms of regulation, let's be clear, the Fed and FDIC have said they do have the regulatory powers to prevent further bank failures and to hold banks accountable. It's their job to do it. It's Congress's job to hold them accountable and ensure they do it.
Senator Kari Lake has been in town this week. She's made her second visit here this year, I should say, talking with the NRSC. Ruben Gallego has been talking about you a lot in the media. And I wonder if you can tell us what your timeline is for making a decision on a potential run for re-election.
I don't have anything to offer to you on that point. As you can tell, I am 100% invested and focused on doing the work for Arizona in the United States Senate right now. As I say, politics can wait to another day. But right now, we have so many challenges on our plate. Arizonans can count on me to stay 100% focused on meeting those challenges.
But as you do your work in the Senate and look towards your future, can you rule out caucusing with the Republican Party?
Well, I've been asked and answered that question numerous times. And as I said just about a week and a half ago, you don't leave one broken party to join another. Arizonans and Americans across this country are hungry for leaders who are not invested in one party or the other, and who don't march to the drum when they're told to do something, and who, importantly, are willing to get out of those partisan boxes and solve the challenges we face in our country. I've demonstrated to Arizonans over the last 20 years of service that I can be that person and have been that person. And I know they can count on me to continue doing that work. So folks can count on me to be the same independent voice I've always been.
I have to ask you about an important issue for your state, and I know it's something that you take very personally, Senator, and that's what's happening at our southern border. You're up with a bipartisan bill to extend Title 42. That was just rescinded. Are you getting support in that effort in the Senate?
Well, I'm so glad you've asked about this because it's the #1 issue on Arizonans' mind right now. When the administration ended Title 42 without an appropriate plan in place, once again, the burden falls on the shoulders of Arizona's border communities. And of course, this is a growing humanitarian crisis for the migrants themselves. So Senator Tillis and I have introduced a bill to extend the elements of Title 42 so that the administration can do what it should have done over the last 2 years, which is prepare for the end of this program. We are growing in support and have gathered 6 co-sponsors of both political parties because people all across the country are seeing what's happening in states like Arizona and Texas. They see migrants coming to their own states in the interior, and they know that this system is broken. It's time for us to give more opportunity for the administration to prepare for the end of Title 42. In the meantime, Senator Tillis and I are continuing to work on our bipartisan framework in a bicameral way to actually address the deeper causes that are creating this problem. So securing our border, solving our broken asylum system, addressing our visa issues, and continuing to work to solve this in a bipartisan and bicameral way.
On the subject of it being bicameral, of course, ahead of the end of Title 42, we did see an immigration measure passing in the House. They called it the Secured the Border Act. Are there parts of that you could get on board with? Where is the opportunity here for compromise?
Well, it was an important step forward that House Republicans passed a border security package. There are parts of that package that are very useful and some parts that aren't very practical or helpful. But what's important is that there was movement. We haven't seen movement in a bicameral way in over 20 years in Congress on immigration. So this was an important first step. Now, it'll be no surprise when I tell you that I've been working with my colleagues in the House for months as they were developing this legislation, and we're continuing to work together as the Senate will create a bipartisan package to overlay and make changes to their piece of legislation and to add in elements that are important, like asylum reform, visa issues, and our Dreamers. So we have work to do, but I'm heartened by the fact that they're moving forward.
In our remaining moment here, Senator, President Biden has taken fire from both sides of the aisle on this issue of the border. What does he not understand about this?
Well, I invite President Biden and Vice President Harris to come actually visit the Arizona-Mexico border. If they were to do so, like many of my colleagues have joined me in recent months, they'll see the devastation, not just to our border communities, but to the migrants and those families themselves. The reality is the system is broken, and we need both enforcement on the part of the administration and changes on the part of Congress to fix the law and solve this problem once and for all.
Our exclusive interview today with Independent Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside Kaylee Lyons, and joining us around the table to discuss today, Bloomberg's Washington Bureau Chief Peggy Collins, joined by national security reporter Dan Flatley. Peggy, I'm going to start with you because there's just a lot of noise around this debt ceiling issue that we started with our conversation with the senator. She's got her own take on this. We're not going to talk about red lines today, apparently, but we're hearing a lot of different versions about what's going on. What we are reporting, though, at Bloomberg is that Kevin McCarthy thinks he could get a bill on the floor next week. That strikes me as a situation where the needle is moving. There is progress.
And the progress seems to be in the positive direction. So, I mean, the market took it really well today. The S&P soared. So that's an indication that people are thinking they could get a deal, as you're saying, Joe, and it could be soon and ahead of that June 1st X date, as the Treasury likes to call it, and others, of when we could start having trouble paying our bills. So I think today is the positive direction arrow there. The concern is that it's harder to fall if they don't get it, right? If people are getting excited about it and then it starts to fall apart, it's going to be harder.
Well, and of course, you have to consider the optics of not just how people are viewing this domestically, but also we were just speaking with Anne-Marie, who is in Japan, where the president also is. He's meeting with G7 leaders. I'm sure he's having some difficult conversations about getting his house in order and what's going on back home. How does this play on the international stage?
Well, it's a great question because, you know, the U.S. and its allies are sort of engaged in an all-out economic war, certainly against Russia, and they're gearing up for a period of contention with China, and it's all basically premised on the strength of the dollar. So, you know, when you have this playing out in D.C., where it looks like there could be some doubts about how this all plays out, it certainly doesn't help Biden make the case to his partners and allies in Hiroshima that, you know, we're all on solid footing here. So, you know, it makes his job a little bit more difficult.
Senator Sinema did not want to get into the specifics around work requirements, Peggy, which really seems to be kind of the sensitive negotiating point right now, certainly one of them. Based on what you're hearing, though, is that what this is going to come down to? Because, you know, Senator Bernie Sanders sent a letter to the White House with 10 colleagues today saying it's time to invoke the 14th Amendment. They don't want any part of this work requirement conversation. So the president is watching progressives potentially fall off the backside of this negotiation.
Well, I think it's a number of things. It's the spending caps. You know, the Republicans are talking about we have to get some of our discretionary spending under control, and then the worker requirements. But I also think that one of the things Independent Senator Sinema was mentioning is that, you know, there's going to be blame to go around on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, if they don't get a deal done. So I think that is one of the things that's really driving this forward. No one's going to escape this without some people in the American public saying, hey, you should have gotten this done.
Yeah, and it's a good question that we've continued to ask is who ultimately takes the blame for this? Because up until recently, it seemed both sides were convinced it was going to be the other one. Right. Ultimately, as we talk about the issue of spending cuts or caps, the duration of those, you cover national security. Obviously, what they don't really want to touch or what seems like it's non-negotiable is anything related to defense. So what are we actually talking about here? Because it seems like it's a pretty narrow basket of things.
Yeah, certainly Congress never wants to touch the defense budget. It's sort of sacrosanct. And there are many reasons for that. Politically, it's not popular, but there's obviously things going on in the world where they don't want to move things around too much there. What struck me listening to Senator Sinema was how squarely she sits in the center of a lot of these politics. And so, as Peggy was talking about earlier, you have the people in the room who are negotiating this, who have been empowered by Biden and empowered by Speaker McCarthy to try to get this deal done. And they're sort of in the center, too, because they're in the room and working this out. What we haven't heard from yet in terms of volume is the progressives on the left and some of the more conservative members on the right. And so that is where the happy talk from today could run into some problems in the next few days.
Yeah, well, of course, Joe, we got that letter from the House Freedom Caucus saying that they shouldn't be talking anymore until the Senate passes the bill the House passed.
A lot of letters flying around here today.
You look at the sides of this issue, and it raises some questions about how much room for compromise there really is. Thank you both so much for joining us. Of course, our Bureau Chief, Peggy Collins, as well as national security reporter Dan Flatley. Now, coming up, we're going to dive deeper into the debt ceiling fight and what it means for big banks. Alec Phillips, chief political economist of Goldman Sachs Research, will be joining us to discuss. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. So, John, if you could just kind of let us inside the room how this goes down at Treasury. When Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says early June, as early as June 1st, do we take that as gospel or is this really fuzzy?
Yes. When she delivers that date, it's no joke and there's no smoke.
All right, we heard him, Joe. No joke, no smoke. That was part of our conversation yesterday with John Rizzo, the former Treasury spokesperson. Meanwhile, the Treasury cash balance has fallen to just $68.3 billion, its lowest level since 2021. Wow. Joining us now to discuss is Alec Phillips. He is chief political economist of Goldman Sachs Research. So, Alec, we have the latest numbers out of the Treasury. The former Treasury spokesperson says when she says June 1, she means it really could be June 1. What is Goldman's latest assessment of the potential X date?
Well, I think she's right that it could be June 1. It also could be June 8th or 9th. And it also could be, though probably not, sometime in July. So our guess right now is that the real deadline is probably more like June 8th, 9th. Mm-hmm. That's when they're at sort of greatest risk. But, the reality is that Congress has to do this at some point very soon. Yeah. And they should just go ahead and do it. So waiting for the last minute isn't necessarily the right move, even though we think that maybe they could go a little bit longer.
Last time you were with us, Alec, we talked about a potential downgrade. S&P and Fitch seem to have a different posture, certainly according to what you told us, than they did in 2011. That downgrade actually hit 2 weeks before the so-called X date, but also followed a deal being struck. What's different this time?
So what's different this time, I think, is that there is more, there's more perceived risk that we might actually miss some payments. Mm-hmm. And so what, for example, Fitch has said is that they would downgrade even if some payments are missed, not Treasury securities, but just, Social Security, Medicare, and so on. Yeah. I think there's also a chance that the rating agencies would put the U.S. on so-called negative watch ahead of the X date, essentially sort of preemptively saying that there's a chance that that downgrade may happen. I think that the odds of a downgrade actually happening, though, are pretty low because I think that the odds of a missed payment are pretty low.
Obviously, we've talked a lot about what happens if we get too close to the X date or go over it. We also have to talk about what happens if there is a deal and the debt ceiling is raised and what the Treasury is going to have to do, because in theory it needs to restore all that cash balance. We're probably going to see a tidal wave of T-bill sales. Yep. How worried should we be about the liquidity issues that could follow?
So the simplest way to think about it is that the liquidity issues that will happen after the debt limit is raised are more or less the mirror image of what happened at the start of this whole process. So it's not like we haven't seen sort of the other side of this. But basically what's going to happen is the Treasury, having run down its cash balance to, probably pretty close to zero by the time this is all done, is going to issue, something like $500, $600 billion worth of bills over the course of several weeks. And the concern is that that is going to pull money out of other places and put it basically on the Fed's balance sheet where it's not being invested in equities or whatever else. I think it is something to keep an eye on. And there's a particular issue this time, which is we also have bank stress.
Right,
and I don't think that it's a major risk to deposits, but on the margin, it's probably not helpful for keeping deposits in banks.
Thank you, Alec. Alec Phillips, great conversation. We thank you. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for coming along. The debate heating up on whether to impose work requirements and spending cuts in a looming debt deal. The Congressional Black Caucus saying now that setting these requirements would be, quote, cruel and ill-advised, calling it a recipe for expanding racial and gender disparities. Joining us now at this stage of the debate to talk about it all is Democratic Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan of Virginia. Congresswoman, welcome to Bloomberg. It's great to have you. Your district stretches from the city of Richmond to the rural areas in the southern portion of Virginia. So I suspect you're hearing a lot of different things right now. Though with what we heard from the CBC in mind, do you see the president's openness to additional work requirements as a betrayal to progressive Democrats?
Well, I think the CBC has made clear that any work requirements are a deal breaker for us, and I'm focused on making sure that that doesn't happen.
So you would not vote if ultimately the deal is reached between Speaker McCarthy and the White House that includes work requirements, which, relatively speaking, if the health benefits aren't touched, as the president has indicated he wouldn't support, is relatively a small amount. You would not vote yes and potentially allow the U.S. to default over that issue?
Well, here's the problem. If you have work requirements, particularly for Medicaid and SNAP, they have been proven not to be effective in actually having people in the workforce. What it would do is kick people off of these benefits. When you kick them off of Medicaid, they're still going to be treated. Those costs are going to be passed on to the rest of the healthcare system. It will impact both urban and rural hospitals. And so I think that you would basically be still causing a problem for the American people with those work requirements. We need to raise the debt ceiling cleanly and then have a separate conversation around spending going forward.
Well, what are you hearing about a final product here, Congresswoman? There's been a lot of talk today about various contours of this deal, and some of the elements could be difficult to pass once this gets to the floor and once it gets to the Senate, for that matter. Here's Senator Bernie Sanders talking today in a news conference about potentially invoking the 14th Amendment instead of going down the road that we're discussing. Let's listen.
If you don't do what we demand that you do, we are prepared to allow the United States government to default and bring our economy and the world's economy into turmoil. That's what the Republicans are essentially saying.
If it's an alternative to additional work requirements or some of the other elements we're discussing, Congresswoman, would you support that path?
I support a clean bill to raise the debt ceiling, and then we can have conversations about spending going forward. We've done that 78 times. We did that 3 times under the previous administration, and that's where I hope we will land between now and June 1st or around that time. And I think the Republicans' attempt to hold our economy hostage for their preferred policy cuts is irresponsible.
Yeah. But should the president consider something like the 14th Amendment as an alternative to this debate?
I think the president is looking at all options and is hopeful that we will have a clean increase of the debt ceiling in time.
Speaking of some of those options, we also know that some of your colleagues in the House put forward a discharge petition as a potential avenue to raise the debt ceiling. I believe, Congresswoman, that you signed it. But do you really think that stands a chance in this House of Representatives?
You know, I think I am an eternal optimist, so I am hopeful that we will get there one way or another, and that discharge petition is one option.
Well, there are certainly a lot of options here, Congresswoman, but I'd like to get to your district. That's where we started here. You've got a very unique situation where you're representing a blue capital city and potentially very red rural areas. How do you straddle the interests of such a diverse district in Virginia?
Frankly, when I was in the state legislature for almost 18 years, I saw that the needs of rural America, rural Virginia, and urban Virginia are very similar. Both have issues with access to health care, both have issues with access to food security, access to jobs that pay well. And I think when we focus more on what we have in common, then we will have a much better product. And I have done that for 18 years as a state legislator. I'm focused on doing that here in Congress as well.
And of course, in Congress, you sit on a few different committees, including the Armed Services Committee. Obviously, Virginia is a state with a heavy military and veteran presence. Your district is right next to the district in which Norfolk and all of that military presence is there. On the subject of armed services, I'm sure you're well aware of what is happening in the Senate, what Senator Tuberville is doing, holding up some of these defense nominees. What are you hearing in House Armed Services about the potential damage that could cause, what that is doing?
I mean, that is particularly irresponsible. I joined a letter from particularly the women on the Armed Services Committee pushing for the confirmations to move forward. Again, we should not be holding our military leadership hostage because we are trying to give access to comprehensive health care to all of our service members. And that's exactly what he's doing, and it's irresponsible.
Well, let's hold with that just for a moment while we're talking about the Pentagon. Congresswoman, you're aware that there's a lot of discussion about defense spending right now. There have actually been some conservative Republicans suggesting that we need to cut defense spending and not continue funding the war in Ukraine. Are you worried about what the Pentagon will be left with at the end of this debate in Washington?
Look, we need to fund our defense budget to the level that we need to protect American interests at home and abroad and to protect democracy, not just here in America, but in Europe and in the Ukraine. We know that if Putin is successful in his illegal invasion in the Ukraine, it won't end there. History has proven that. And so I think we need to make sure that we give our armed services what they need to do their job.
All right, Congresswoman, we will leave it on that note. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That's Representative Jennifer McClellan of Virginia, a Democrat. Thank you very much. Now, coming up, we will turn to our panel as we dive into the political ramifications of President Biden's trip to Japan for the G7 and what effect there may be by him cutting the trip short. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Now, keeping up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak appears to have backed down on his Conservative Party's pledge to cut net migration. That could lead to a new disagreement with the right-wing Tories. Reporters traveling with Sunak to the G7 summit in Japan asked Sunak whether he stood by the party's promise on migration. He declined to repeat the commitment. The U.S. Supreme Court has left in place a broad liability shield for social media companies for content posted by users. Acting in a case involving Google, the court said it wouldn't rule on efforts to limit the immunity internet companies have enjoyed under a decades-old law. The ruling insulates Twitter, Facebook, and Google from claims they provided assistance to Islamic State terrorists. Walmart is raising its annual profit forecast after posting better-than-expected earnings in the first quarter. Comparable sales easily beat Wall Street estimates, but still, Walmart expects shoppers to remain under pressure this year. And staying in the world of business, shares of game maker Take-Two are surging. The company beat quarterly sales estimates and hinted at a release date for its new version of a popular Grand Theft Auto game. Take-Two's forecast calls for a huge rebound in the fiscal year of 2025, leading to speculation that the new game would be out then. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Originals. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Here in Washington, the debt ceiling drama continues, and the president is taking part from afar, currently in Japan for the G7 summit in Hiroshima. Joining us now is our political panel, John Sidolides, the geopolitical advisor at Trilogy Advisors, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. So, John, I'd like to start with you because obviously we have talked so much about the back and forth, the stubbornness, the lack of progression or maybe some progression today on the debt ceiling conversation here at home. The president had to take that baggage with him on Air Force One. He now has to address this issue with other world leaders at the G7. How tough is that job? The optics seem difficult.
It may be very difficult because there may be world leaders who are hearing, say, the previous panelists that you had here saying that June 1 is not a hard and fast deadline. And if that's the case, why didn't the White House plan for this more effectively these past several weeks, past several months, when they knew that this could go deeper into June, possibly into July? And so is it really about the debt negotiations? I mean, even if the president did go to Australia and to Papua New Guinea after Japan, he'd be back here by May 25th. That gives him 5 or 6 days to wrap up negotiations that staff is working on with Kevin McCarthy's people. So I think there's also a question abroad as to whether or not the president's physical stamina is up to speed. And I'm not sure it's only about debt negotiations. Wow. And that's a credibility issue that we're going to have to deal with in the weeks ahead.
Jeannie, I'm not sure your thoughts on that, but we hear a story pretty often from the president he refers to in a lot of speeches. First time he attended a NATO summit. And he said, I showed up there and I said, America is back. And I was asked, but for how long? Is he being asked that again at the G7?
He absolutely is, and on a number of fronts. Let's not forget, we had Donald Trump at a town hall just last week talking about the fact that within 24 hours he would resolve Ukraine. This has been hanging over the heads of many of these leaders as we go over there to think about how we can help Ukraine defeat Russia. And so then you look at the debt ceiling, as you were just talking about. This is a huge challenge hanging over the entire G7, because if we default or come close to it, the damage to the U.S. and the world economy is dramatic. So he is absolutely being asked these things. And I do think he made an important, difficult decision to come back on Sunday. I think it's important that as we get closer to this, that he is here. So while we want to reschedule Papua New Guinea and Australia, critically important to meet the Quad, he has to be here to see this through, because the closer we get, the more damage that is done. We saw that in 2011. We didn't default. We still had a downgrade. We are now 14 days away from that with no guarantees we get over this line. And we don't know the line, June 1st, June 9th, whatever it is. The president should be in the United States to see this through.
So it seems, John, that Jeannie does think it was ultimately the good decision to cut Australia and Papua New Guinea off of the itinerary. When we first learned he was going to Papua New Guinea, I feel like we all were sitting around in our meeting and we were like, just to be the first president to go? Why is that important? Is there a cost to cutting that off the itinerary?
The cost over the long term could be enormous. I mean, what you have right now is a tactical decision to get back here in time, supposedly, for the debt negotiations. But if we're serious about putting together an alliance of countries, Australia, Japan, India, and then these countries that are in Oceania and the Southern Pacific that nobody in America has ever heard of, but are critically important because of their location. I mean, Papua New Guinea is the size of California. It has a massive exclusive economic zone. It's attached to Indonesia. It's north of Australia. And if the Chinese are able to engage in a security cooperation agreement with the Solomon Islands next door to Papua New Guinea, they close off the shipping lanes that would be important to connect Japan, Australia, and the U.S. in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. The long-term consequences here could be very, very significant for the purposes of dealing with short-term tactical political negotiations.
You know, with all this talk about China right now, I'm kind of amazed that no one has been talking in Washington about the TikTok ban, which was a lead story for days when that was being considered. They have now soaked lobbyists with a lot of money to get people to get their eyes off the ball, apparently. But in Montana, in the state of Montana, there is, in fact, a ban that'll kick in next year on downloading the app. Jeannie, I wonder your thoughts on this as we see the news in Montana, of all states. Could that be the foundation for an eventual national ban?
It may very well be. And as we know, we've already seen two proposed bills in the Senate, one by Thune, one by Marco Rubio, joined by other senators. So one of those may go forward. But certainly Montana beat the rest of the states, not just banning it on their governmental public devices, but across the state. The question, though, is how do you enforce that? The proponents are talking about it's similar to online gambling. You can sort of use, some kind of geo sort of fencing around the state. But as we know, having children, you can set up a VPN to get through those kinds of things. So there's a lot of workarounds. Plus, there's going to be several lawsuits, one supported by the ACLU. So I think it's going to be a while. This goes into effect January 1st, if it does indeed go into effect at all.
Yeah, it's the constitutional question. Is this a violation of First Amendment rights to free speech when these content creators are no longer able to express themselves on this platform? But the reason why you would put this ban into place, despite probably knowing those legal challenges are coming, largely comes down to the issue of security concerns. The China question, as Joe was mentioning. How real is that threat that such an extreme measure, despite the legal murkiness around it, needs to be taken?
I think the governor of Montana is very much concerned about the well-being of his citizenry, because we do know that the Chinese government is able to access data of any company that is based in China, that the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party demand access to data for. TikTok's CEO tried to make the case when he was here a couple of months ago that that's not the case, that they're going to firewall all of this data information in Texas and the like. But I think, to Jeannie's point, it's a very good one. I don't know how you geofence an app store. That seems to be very troublesome from the Montana perspective. But also there's a constitutional issue not only on the First Amendment, but a bill of attainder. This legislation, or this executive order, targets a single company. And in America, we don't pass laws to target individual citizens or individual companies. So I think there'll be a constitutional argument back on First Amendment and a bill of attainder.
That's why that Mark Warner bill got so much talk, because it didn't specifically target TikTok. It just gave the Commerce Department the tools to do something about it. Coming up, the battle between Disney and Florida intensifying, and how the theme park operator shutting down a hotel now and canceling a plan to move thousands of staff to Florida. We'll discuss that next with our panel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. The battle goes on between DeSantis and Disney. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and of course the Disney Corporation, which today says it is dropping a plan to add 2,000 workers to Florida. And while they're at it, they're shuttering a hotel that's on the park. Our panel is back with more on this. A pretty remarkable situation here that we've talked about. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino joined as well alongside John Sidolides. Jeannie, this is not exactly classic conservative behavior, as we've discussed, for Ron DeSantis, but the company is pushing back here. What does this mean for the governor of Florida?
It means don't fight the mouse, Joe Matthew. Don't take him on. He doesn't like it. I think I heard Anne Marie talking earlier about economic retaliation as an issue at G7. And I think that Disney has a very good case here to say that the governor of Florida has engaged in economic bullying and economic retaliation because the company took issue with some of his very conservative stances. And so I think the company was absolutely right to file the lawsuit that they did, claiming it's anti-business, to your point, and against their free speech rights, and also to do what any business or individual would do when under attack, say, I'm not going to do business there. So this is bad for Florida, and as Ron DeSantis tries to move national, people need to think about how he has treated the state of Florida and what this has done there.
Yeah, well, Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, on the company's earnings call just last week was talking about how he thinks this was a retaliatory move. He also went on to say this in particular.
This is about one thing and one thing only, and that's retaliating against us for taking a position about pending legislation. And we believe that in us taking that position, we are merely exercising our right to free speech. Does the state want us to invest more, employ more people, and pay more taxes, or not?
So clearly it's a no for Disney right now on spending more and employing more people in Florida, at least when it comes to this particular project. But especially as Jeannie talks about this concept of economic retaliatory measures, how does this play on a more broad level of thinking about corporate America dealing with these political issues? Because obviously Disney is Exhibit A, but this goes beyond that. We were just talking about TikTok in China.
I think this could be a good, what do they call this, an educational moment or a teachable moment for Americans, both as citizens and in terms of corporations. Because I think in the United States, and I'm taking a constitutional perspective on this, that every individual should be able to engage in free speech without fear of retaliation by government officials. And this pertains to citizens, whether they're on the left or the right, and it pertains to corporations, which have those same rights. So I think Governor DeSantis will have a little bit of a difficult time explaining this to his more constitutional base. But I think in Florida, this plays pretty well. I think Disney right now is not very popular in Florida. I don't know how many Floridians want another 2,000 jobs coming in to a state that's teeming with inflow. But more importantly, how does this play in terms of DeSantis's probable presidential run?
Yes.
And to Jeannie's point, I think if it's going to be Mickey Mouse versus Governor DeSantis, I think Mickey Mouse tends to win. So I'm not sure what the political strategy is inside the DeSantis blossoming campaign.
Yeah.
But it may play one way in Florida and in a very different and deleterious way nationwide.
A lot of questions about this, Jeannie. I know he's going to be disappointing a lot of Star Wars geeks like me who wanted to spend $5,000 to spend 2 nights in this bizarre space hotel. But we got a statement from the Trump campaign. The headline, Ron DeSanctimonious gets caught in the mousetrap. He's going to be announcing his campaign within days. What should be his posture when he's asked about this war with Disney as he tries to gather votes across the country?
You know, the problem for Ron DeSantis is he has no choice but to buckle down on this. This has been the centerpiece of what he is trying to sell to the United States, which is I will do to the U.S. what I have done to Florida. And in this case, to John's point, people may not want him to do that across the country. And so I think this is a tough sell. The other thing we're hearing, he plans to run to the right of Donald Trump on issues like abortion, on issues like transgender rights, on issues like teaching AP African American history courses. These are things that may sell well in a Republican primary, but they may not sell so well in a general election. How do you make that case and also say you can beat Donald Trump? Very, very tough to do.
All right, Jeannie, thank you. Jeannie Shanzano and John Sidolides, thanks for a great conversation on Bloomberg.
All right, and make sure you check out our Washington edition newsletter on the terminal and online. That wraps it up for me and Joe. Thanks for joining us. This is Bloomberg. We'll see you tomorrow.